I'm Franklin. This is Case 309. Don't look for a hero. There isn't one. 60 miles outside of Las Vegas, where the neon glow dies and the horizon becomes a jagged line of black rock, stands the Dusty Spur. It's a motel for people who have run out of road. The sign flickers with a persistent electric hum, a dying heartbeat in the middle of nowhere. It smells of scorched sagebrush, diesel exhaust, and the kind of cheap bleach that's used to hide things rather than clean them. In this place, privacy isn't a courtesy. It's a commodity. You pay in cash, you don't use your real name, and you don't look the manager in the eyes, because his eyes have seen enough misery to fill a shallow grave. Elias Vance arrived at 3:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. He drove a rusted-out 1984 Chevy Impala that groaned as it came to a halt in front of the office. He didn't look like a man on vacation. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. His skin had the grayish, translucent quality of someone who hadn't seen a vegetable or a sunlight in 6 months. His hands didn't just shake, they twitched, a rhythmic, neurological glitch that he tried to hide by shoving them deep into the pockets of a stained trench coat. He asked for room 309, specifically. The manager didn't ask why. He just took the damp 20s, handed over a brass key with a chipped plastic tag, and watched Vance haul 3 heavy, rectangular suitcases toward the far end of the lot. Those suitcases didn't roll. They were heavy enough to strain his shoulders, dragging across the gravel with a sound like bones scraping on stone. Room 309 was at the very end of the row, tucked into a corner where the outdoor floodlights didn't quite reach. It was a box of stale air and yellowing wallpaper. The carpet was a muddy brown, stained by decades of spilled bourbon and things far less legal. Vance didn't unpack clothes. The moment the door clicked shut, he engaged the deadbolt and the security chain. He didn't turn on the main light. He moved in the dim, rhythmic orange pulse of the neon sign outside. He dragged the heavy suitcases into the center of the room and clicked them open. There was no sound of rustling fabric, only the cold, sterile clink of stainless steel. Inside the first case were jars, dozens of them. Some were empty. Others were filled with a yellowish brine, housing shapes that defied immediate identification. Fleshy, pale things that bobbed in the fluid like pickled organs. The smell hit the room instantly. A sharp, acidic bite of formaldehyde mixed with something rancid, something that smelled like a butcher shop's dumpster in the July heat. Vance began his work. He didn't use the desk. He pulled the plastic shower curtain from the bathroom and spread it over the bed. He moved with a practiced, terrifying precision. Out came the tools, scalpels with oxidized handles, heavy-duty bone saws, and a collection of industrial-grade syringes. He took a roll of silver duct tape and began sealing the gaps around the door and the windows. He wasn't trying to keep people out. He was trying to keep the smell in. By 5 a.m., the room had been transformed. The Dusty Spur was no longer a motel room. It was a laboratory of the grotesque. Vance stripped down to his undershirt, revealing a chest so thin his ribs looked like a cage for a dying animal. He began to pin photographs to the wall above the headboard. These weren't family photos. They were Polaroids. Close-ups. A bruised neck. A hand with the fingernails missing. A wide-eyed stare frozen in the flash of a camera. The last thing those eyes had ever seen. There were 12 photos in total. 12 faces that had been wiped off the map, ignored by a world that didn't care about the missing, the broken, and the lost. Vance stared at the photos, his breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. He reached into the second suitcase and pulled out a heavy, wet bundle wrapped in a stained canvas tarp. As he unwrapped it on the bed, the trash of his reality became undeniable. It wasn't a whole body. It was a collection. A jigsaw puzzle made of human remains, harvested from different sources, kept cold in a bed of dry ice that was now mostly gas. He wasn't a killer looking for a thrill. He was a craftsman. He was looking for something specific. He was looking for a way to build something that wouldn't leave him. The first night, the neighbors in room 307, a pair of drifters passing through, heard the noise. It wasn't a scream. It was a wet, rhythmic thud. Thwack, 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 followed by the high-pitched whine of a hand-cranked drill. They complained to the manager the next morning. The manager just shrugged. "Maybe he's a carpenter," he said, biting into a stale donut. "Long as he doesn't bleed through the ceiling, I don't care what he builds." But Vance wasn't building furniture. He was standing over the bathtub, which was now half filled with a concoction of lye and drain cleaner. He was staring at his own reflection in the cracked medicine cabinet mirror. He picked up a scalpel. His hand, for the first time since he arrived, stopped shaking. He realized the echo he was trying to capture, the perfect, silent companion, was missing a heart, and he knew exactly where to find a fresh one. By the second night, the air in the hallway outside room 309 had changed. It was no longer just the smell of desert dust and stale tobacco. It was something heavy, something that clung to the back of the throat like grease. It was the scent of a long-forgotten cellar, opened after a century. Elias Vance hadn't left the room once. Not for food, not for water. The Do Not Disturb sign hung limp on the doorknob, its plastic edges curling in the heat. Inside, the light was a sickly yellow, filtered through the thick layer of cigarette smoke and the steam rising from the bathroom. Vance was no longer the man who had checked in. His eyes were bloodshot, the pupils pinpricks of black ice. He had stopped wearing the trench coat. His bare skin was covered in a fine layer of salt and sweat, his ribs protruding like the hull of a wrecked ship. He was working on the collection laid out on the bed. The tarp was now slick with a dark, viscous fluid that refused to dry. Vance was sewing. He used heavy, waxed upholstery thread and a curved needle designed for leather. Each stitch was a slow, agonizing labor. He wasn't just joining skin. He was trying to create a tapestry of grief. He hummed to himself, a low, tuneless vibration that sounded like a hornet trapped in a jar. The echo was taking shape. It was a grotesque mannequin of human parts, a Frankenstein's monster for the nihilistic age. A torso from a hitchhiker missing since '88. Arms from a runaway who had vanished in Reno. Legs from a man who had simply walked out of his office and into the void. Vance was obsessed with the seams. He believed that if he could make the stitches invisible, the soul would find its way back into the shell. He used a jeweler's loupe to inspect the work, his face inches away from the cold, gray flesh. "Almost," he whispered. His voice was a dry rattle, like dead leaves on pavement. Almost enough room for two. In room 307, the drifters, a man named Miller and his girlfriend Sarah, weren't sleeping. The wall between them and 309 was thin, made of cheap plasterboard and rot. They could hear everything, not the words, but the intent. They heard the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor, then the sound of liquid being poured, gallons of it, into the bathtub. Then came the scratching, a frantic, rhythmic scratching, like a dog trying to dig through concrete. "I'm telling you, Miller, something's dying in there," Sarah whispered, her eyes fixed on the wall. She was clutching a jagged piece of glass she'd broken from a beer bottle. "Paranoia is contagious in the desert, and room 309 was the epicenter." "Shut up," Miller hissed, though his own hand was white-knuckled around the grip of a rusted .38. "People do their business here. We don't interfere. That's the rule." But then came the sound that broke the rule. It was a wet, metallic snap, like a dry branch breaking, but muffled by meat. It was followed by a low, guttural moan that didn't sound human. It sounded like a machine trying to scream. Vance had reached the most difficult part of his masterpiece. He needed a spine, and he realized that the ones he had brought in the suitcases were too brittle, too corrupted by time and the brine in the jars. He needed something supple, something with the electricity of life still flickering in the marrow. He turned his gaze toward the wall, toward room 307. He didn't see the wall as a barrier. He saw it as a veil. He could hear the blood pumping in Sarah's neck. He could hear the frantic rhythm of Miller's heart. To Vance, they weren't people. They were raw material. They were the final pieces of the puzzle he had been solving for 20 years. He picked up the heavy-duty bone saw. The teeth of the blade were stained with a brownish crust. He didn't turn it on yet. He just ran his thumb along the edge until the skin split, watching the dark bead of blood well up and drip onto the carpet. He walked to the connecting door, the one that stayed locked in every motel room, the one that supposedly offered safety. He pressed his ear against the wood. "I can hear you," he breathed. On the other side, Miller froze. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He looked at the bottom of the door. A dark, oily liquid was beginning to seep through the gap. It wasn't water. It was too thick. It moved with a purposeful slowness, spreading across the carpet of room 307 like an ink blot. Vance began to tap on the door. 1, 2, 3. Slow, deliberate. "The manager said you were a carpenter," Miller shouted, his voice cracking with a fear he couldn't hide. "Get the hell away from the door, man. I've got a gun." Vance didn't stop tapping. He started to laugh. It wasn't a laugh of joy. It was a sound of pure, crystalline madness. The sound of a mind that had finally let go of the shore and was drifting into the deep, dark water. "A carpenter," Vance echoed. "Yes, I'm building a house. For all of us. No more running, no more cold. Just the stitches. Just the beautiful silent stitches." He gripped the handle of the bone saw and pulled the starter cord. The engine roared to life, a high-pitched, screaming mechanical wail that tore through the silence of the Nevada night. In the office, the manager looked up from his crossword puzzle. He heard the scream of the saw. He heard a woman shriek in room 307. He looked at the clock, 3:30 a.m. He sighed, reached for his shotgun under the counter, and took a slow sip of cold coffee. "Goddamn tourists," he muttered. He didn't move to help. He waited. In the Dusty Spur, you don't stop the show. You just wait for the cleanup crew. The wall didn't stand a chance. It wasn't built to resist a man who had replaced his soul with a bone saw. The engine of the saw screamed, a jagged mechanical howl that drowned out the frantic sobbing of Sarah in room 307. Miller fired. The .38 barked twice, the bullets punching small, clean holes through the drywall. But in the dim light and the fog of terror, he was shooting at shadows. Vance didn't flinch. To him, the bullets were just interruptions in a grander symphony. He leaned into the saw. The blade bit into the wood and plaster, spitting out a cloud of white dust and splinters. It smelled like a construction site mixed with a morgue. When the hole was wide enough, Vance didn't rush through. He peeked. His one visible eye was wide, unblinking, reflecting the flickering neon V from the motel sign outside. "Don't worry," Vance whispered through the gap, his voice barely audible over the idling engine of the saw. "I only need the parts that don't talk, the parts that don't lie." Miller fired again, but the gun jammed, a cheap, rusted piece of scrap metal failing at the only moment it mattered. He scrambled backward, his boots sliding in the oily fluid that had now flooded half the room. It was everywhere. It felt like walking on wet ice made of grease. Vance stepped through the ruined wall. He was covered in white plaster dust, looking like a ghost rising from a shallow grave. In his left hand, he held the saw. In his right, a long surgical needle threaded with that thick black upholstery cord. He didn't look at Miller. He looked at Sarah. He looked at her spine, the way it curved as she hovered in the corner of the bed. To him, she wasn't a woman. She was the structural integrity his masterpiece was missing. The alignment, Vance muttered, stepping over the debris. It's all in the alignment. The next 10 minutes in room 307 were a blurred sequence of wet sounds and muffled impacts. In the Dusty Spur, the walls are thick enough to hide the sights, but too thin to hide the vibrations. The guests in 305 put pillows over their heads. The trucker in 311 turned up his TV to drown out the rhythmic thud scrape coming from the corner of the lot. Vance worked with a terrifying, drug-like focus. He didn't enjoy the pain. He was indifferent to it. He was a taxidermist of the living. When Miller tried to fight back, Vance used the bone saw not as a weapon, but as a tool of disassembly. There was no grace in it, just the cold, heavy reality of steel meeting marrow. By the time the sun began to bleed over the Sierra Nevada mountains, room 307 was silent. Vance wasn't done. He was dragging something back through the hole in the wall. It was a heavy, lumpy shape wrapped in the motel's cheap, cigarette-burned bed sheets. The sheets were no longer white. They were a deep, bruised purple, heavy with the weight of Vance's acquisitions. Back in room 309, the masterpiece was waiting. The torso on the bed was now nearly complete. Vance began the final integration. He used the duct tape to secure the new elements to the frame he had built from rusted rebar and stolen medical hardware. He wasn't just sewing anymore. He was grafting. He used a soldering iron to cauterize the seams, the smell of burning hair and flesh filling the small room until the air was thick enough to chew. He was losing his own grip on reality. His vision was tunneling. He started to see the echo move. He thought he saw the mismatched fingers twitch. He thought he heard the chorus of 12 different voices whispering to him from the stitches. "You're almost here," he whimpered, pressing his forehead against the cold gray skin of the torso's chest. "Talk to me. Tell me I'm not alone." But the echo didn't speak. It just sat there, a monument to human wreckage, a silent, bloated god of room 309. Vance realized then that the echo was silent because it was still, empty. It had the flesh, it had the bone, it had the geometry, but it didn't have the essence. It needed a pilot. He looked at his own reflection in the blood-spattered mirror. He saw the grayish skin, the hollow eyes, the trembling hands. He was a dying man. He had been dying since the day he started this collection. He picked up the last syringe, the one filled with a dark, concentrated solution of potassium chloride and a cocktail of paralytics he'd stolen from a veterinary clinic. "One more stitch," he whispered. He climbed onto the bed, lying down next to the echo. He began to sew his own left arm to the echo's right side. He pushed the needle through his own skin with a grunt of focused agony, pulling the black thread tight until his flesh puckered against the cold remains of his victims. He was weaving himself into his own nightmare. Outside, the first rays of the desert sun hit the "Do Not Disturb" sign. It fluttered in the morning breeze. The motel manager was finally walking down the row, a heavy ring of keys jangling at his hip. He noticed the dark, flies-covered liquid dripping from the threshold of 309 onto the gravel. He stopped. He spat a glob of tobacco juice into the dust. "God damn it, Vance," he muttered. "I told you not to bleed through the floor." The manager of the Dusty Spur, a man named Henderson whose soul had been eroded by 40 years of desert sun and cheap whiskey, didn't call the police right away. First, he went to the shed and grabbed a gas mask from the surplus era. He knew that smell. It wasn't just death. It was death that had been chemically altered. He kicked the door of room 309. It didn't budge. The deadbolt and the duct tape held firm. He used his master key, leaning his entire weight against the wood. When the seal finally broke, the sound was like a wet lung collapsing. The air that rushed out was visible, a hazy, yellowish miasma of formaldehyde, burnt copper, and rot. Henderson took one step inside, squinted through the fogged-out goggles of his mask, and immediately vomited into his own throat. The room was a cathedral of gore. The walls were no longer wallpapered. They were draped in tapestries of human skin, pinned up with rusted nails. The Polaroids were gone, replaced by the actual trophies they depicted. But the center of the room, the bed, was where the logic of the world simply stopped. Vance was there. He had succeeded in his grafting. He was literally sewn into the side of the Echo. He looked like a parasitic twin, his pale, shivering body attached to a bloated, multi-limbed trunk of mismatched remains. The black upholstery thread was pulled so tight it had disappeared into his inflamed skin. He wasn't dead. Not yet. When he saw Henderson, Vance didn't scream. He didn't plead. He just turned his head, the only part of him still fully mobile, and bared his teeth. They had been filed down to sharp, jagged points. "He's breathing," Vance croaked, nodding toward the headless, stitched-together mass he was fused to. "Can't you hear it, Henderson? The collective heart. It's beating for the first time." Henderson didn't stay to listen. He scrambled backward, falling over the heap of debris in the doorway, and ran for the office. He dialed 911 with fingers that refused to stop shaking. 20 minutes later, the silence of the desert was shattered. 2 Nevada State Trooper cruisers and a local sheriff's SUV roared into the gravel lot, sirens wailing. A sound that usually meant nothing out here, but today felt like the world was finally closing in. The lead trooper, a veteran named Miller, no relation to the man in the next room, stepped out with his shotgun leveled. He'd seen cartel hits and meth lab explosions, but as he approached the threshold of 309, the hair on his neck stood up. "Vance, this is the sheriff's department. Come out with your hands where we can see them." Inside the room, a frantic, wet, tearing sound erupted. Vance wasn't going to surrender. He was terrified of being unmade. He grabbed a rusted surgical knife and, in a fit of adrenaline-fueled madness, began to cut himself free from his masterpiece. He didn't care about the pain. He sliced through the black threads and through his own flesh, leaving chunks of himself attached to the bed as he rolled onto the floor. He was a mess of open wounds and chemical burns, dripping a mixture of blood and preservative fluid. He looked less like a man and more like a flayed animal. He didn't go for the front door. He went through the hole he'd cut into room 307. The police breached the front door of 309 just as Vance was scrambling through the wreckage of the wall. When they saw the Echo on the bed, that pulsating, stitched-together horror, one of the younger officers turned away and began to wail. It was too much for the human mind to process in a single glance. "He's in the next room," the sheriff shouted, his voice cracking. "Move! Move!" Vance was fast. Fueled by a psychosis that bypassed his body's natural limits, he threw himself through the window of room 307, shattering the glass with his shoulder. He landed in the dirt, the hot Nevada sun hitting his raw skin like a blowtorch. He didn't head for his car. He knew they'd expect that. Instead, he bolted toward the open desert, toward the jagged black rocks of the canyon. He ran with a strange, lopsided gait, clutching a heavy, blood-stained canvas bag, the one containing the essence of his work, the journals, and the last of the jars. "Suspect is on foot, heading north into the scrub." The radio crackled. The troopers didn't hesitate. They didn't want a trial. They didn't want to have to testify about what they had seen on that bed. They wanted the world to be clean again. They wanted the thing that came out of room 309 to stop existing. Vance reached the edge of a dry wash, his lungs burning, his vision swimming in shades of red. He looked back and saw the three figures in tan uniforms spreading out, their rifles raised. The heat shimmer off the desert floor made them look like giants. "Drop the bag, Vance! Down on the ground!" Vance didn't drop the bag. He reached into it. He wanted his journal. He wanted to show them the beauty he had created. But to the troopers, it looked like he was reaching for a weapon hidden in the gore. The wind in the high desert doesn't whistle. It hisses. It carries the fine, alkaline dust that eats away at paint, at wood, and eventually, at memory. Elias Vance stood at the edge of the ravine, his shadow stretching long and distorted across the cracked earth. He was a red stain against a dead landscape. The bag he clutched to his chest was wet, dripping a trail of dark spots that the thirsty sand swallowed instantly. He didn't hear the command to stop. In his mind, the echo was still screaming, not in pain, but in birth. He felt the phantom weight of the stitches still pulling at his side, as if the monster in the room were a magnet, and he was the iron filing. "Vance, last warning!" Sheriff Miller's voice was thin, stripped of authority by the vastness of the Nevada flats. Vance turned. His face was a mask of peeling skin and chemical burns, his eyes two dark pits of absolute conviction. He didn't see the rifles pointed at his heart. He saw the horizon. He reached into the bag, his fingers closing around the cold, jagged handle of the bone saw. He didn't want to kill them. He wanted to show them the tool of their salvation. When he pulled it out, the sunlight glinted off the serrated steel. The first shot hit him in the shoulder, spinning him around. The impact was dull, the sound of a hammer hitting a wet rug. Vance didn't fall. He grunted, a sound of mild annoyance, and took another step toward the officers. He looked like a puppet with its strings being cut one by one. Then came the volley. 3 rifles, firing in a synchronized rhythm of professional fear. The bullets tore through his chest, punching ragged holes through the trench coat he had stolen from room 307. Vance's body jerked with every hit, a grotesque dance in the dust. He finally collapsed at the very lip of the wash. His blood didn't pool. It soaked into the parched earth, turning the pale sand into a dark, clotted crust. He lay there for a moment, his chest heaving, his mouth filling with the taste of copper and dust. He looked up at the sky. It was a cruel, perfect blue. No clouds, no mercy. Is it finished?" he wheezed. The troopers didn't answer. They stood back, their barrels still smoking, watching him die with a mixture of disgust and profound relief. They didn't move to provide first aid. In the Dusty Spur jurisdiction, some wounds are considered a mercy for the world. Vance's hand twitched one last time, reaching for the bag. Then his eyes went dull, reflecting nothing but the empty sky. Elias Vance was no longer a craftsman. He was just another report to be filed, another set of remains to be processed by a coroner who would spend the next 10 years trying to forget what he saw. By sunset, the crime scene tape was already whipping in the wind. The echo in room 309 was hauled away in sections. The bed was burned in a pit behind the motel. The room was stripped to the concrete studs, hosed down with industrial bleach until the smell of chlorine burned the lungs of anyone who walked past. 6 months later, the Dusty Spur was under new management. Room 309 got a fresh coat of beige paint and a new carpet, a dark, thick shag designed to hide any future stains. The police report on Elias Vance was 12 pages long. It detailed the forensic evidence, the recovery of the remains, and the justified use of force. But it didn't mention the journal. It didn't mention the fact that when they finally opened the bag, Vance died protecting. They didn't find a weapon. They found a collection of children's toys, a jar of human teeth, and a handwritten note that read, "I am only trying to put the pieces back together. Why won't the world let me be whole?" The report was filed in a basement in Carson City. It sits in a gray metal cabinet, wedged between a cold case from '74 and a routine traffic fatality. Some deluded people believe that when you die, you leave something behind, a legacy, a soul, a memory. But in the desert, you only leave silence. And in room 309, if you press your ear against the fresh beige wall during the quietest part of the night, you might still hear it. Not a scream, not a cry, just the faint, rhythmic thwack scrape of a needle being pulled through skin. The file is closed, the desert is full, and the sun will rise tomorrow as if nothing ever happened.